Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. As hinted, I will be talking about Antarctica and climate change and some of the things that our recent research has been revealing about both what is happening and the impacts of those changes on the world more broadly. This photo is from the Noyena's most recent voyage down to Antarctica, the Denman Marine voyage. Now, this was its first dedicated scientific voyage, and it was extremely exciting for the community. And there are many spectacular photographs as well as amazing data sets that have come back with the Noyena. But there's something missing from this photo, something that we should have expected there to be rather a lot of around Antarctica at this time of year. And when they arrived, they found almost none of it. So I'm going to let you ponder that for a moment and just briefly divert to saying thank you very much to the Royal Society of Tasmania for the Peter Smith Medal. It's a wonderful honour and a particularly personal one for me. I knew Dr. Smith when I was an undergrad. He generously sponsored a scholarship in the physical sciences, which I was a very grateful recipient of. And this is a photograph from my graduation with honours with Dr. Smith. And we would meet up about once a semester for a little coffee catch-up, and he would proudly tell me about his current students and talk about what I was up to and where I was going. And I was greatly saddened when I learnt that he had passed away while I was overseas. I would also like to say thank you to Professor Nathan Bindoff, who wrote the nomination for the medal. Now, I'm sure many of you know that being a senior academic comes with far more demands on your time than you could ever possibly fulfill. And one thing about Nathan is that he always makes the time for people. And I was very grateful that he took the time to write the nomination and put it all together. So thank you very much to the Society, to Dr. Smith, and to Nathan. So back to Antarctica and climate change. Now, I really like to start talks with this map. It is, as maps go, perhaps not the most useful for navigational purposes, but it highlights one really key feature of the global ocean, and that is that there is just one global ocean, that it all connects, and the place where all of the ocean basins connect is the Southern Ocean, around Antarctica. So you can see the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic look more or less like spokes coming off the hub of Antarctica. And that's really key because it means that Antarctica is the place where these oceans join, where the waters mix and where we can exchange water between the deep ocean and the surface. And this is one of the reasons why climate change around Antarctica can propagate around the world so powerfully. It's because this is where all of our oceans come together. It's also a place where we create the water that fills up almost half of the volume of the ocean. Now, oceanographers talk about creating water masses, particular flavours of ocean water, and we describe that as a particular type of temperature and salinity that the ocean water stores with it as it moves on its journey around the world. So water that has been at the surface near Antarctica sinks down into the abyss and fills up almost half of the volume of the ocean. And that means that changes around Antarctica can affect that water and propagate northwards, affecting everywhere else around the world. And in particular, that water is last at the surface in 4 main sites around Antarctica. You can see them here highlighted in red and orange. There's one in the Weddell Sea, in Prids Bay, the Adelie Coast, and the Ross Sea. So these are places where we form something called dense shelf water. Now, physical oceanographers, as a rule, are not terribly imaginative. So we tend to name our flavours of ocean water by where they come from, what they're like, or where they're found, and the fact that they're water. So dense shelf water is very dense. It's formed on the shelf, and it's ocean water. So after forming on the shelf, it flows down, it cascades off the continental slope into the deep water, mixing with the ocean waters around it, and becoming something called Antarctic bottom water, which comes from Antarctica, is found at the bottom of the ocean, and once again, it's water. Now, the process of forming dense shelf water is intimately linked to the annual cycle of sea ice growth and melt. And this animation, which was produced by Owen Kaluza at Access NRI, which is the Australian Climate and Earth Systems Simulator National Research Infrastructure, that's our climate model development program, largely based in Canberra, but with people spread all across the country. This animation shows us satellite data starting in the data set starts in the late 1970s. The animation that I chose starts in the 80s and runs through. And what you can see is that in the wintertime, there is a vast area of ice, about 19 million square kilometres, or 2.5 times the size of Australia. It's a vast region of ocean water that is covered by sea ice during the winter. During the summer, most of that melts, and we're left with somewhere between 3 and 4 million square kilometres, about half the size of Australia. Still a pretty large, significant chunk of the ocean, but much, much less than during the winter. Because this seasonal cycle is so large, it's quite difficult to see variations from year to year in a plot like this. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take the anomalies. So we're going to work out how much ice we expect to have on any given day of the year, and then subtract that from what we saw. And that gives us a time series of anomalies. So where the graph is positive and blue, that represents more sea ice than we expected on that day. And where it's red and negative, that's less. And you can see a few pretty distinct things in this graph. From the beginning of the record up until the mid-2000s, not a lot was happening. It bumped around. Sometimes there was a bit more ice than normal, sometimes there was a bit less. And then in about 2007, we entered a period where there was generally more ice than normal. And at the time, the community was puzzling over this because the world was warming. Climate change and global warming were, at least in the scientific community, indisputable facts. And yet, around Antarctica, sea ice was expanding. And so the community spent quite a lot of effort trying to understand what was going on here. And our best guess, which is fairly well supported by computer simulations, observations and theories, is that the ozone hole, which was causing the westerly winds to get a little bit stronger in the summer, helped push cold water and ice further north by changing those winds. And this helped the expansion. And also that the giant ice block on Antarctica was melting, and it was pouring a layer of cold, fresh water that sat up near the top of the ocean and helped insulate it from the heat below. And these two factors together, we think, explain why it was expanding. But then in 2015 and 2016, it changed dramatically. And all of a sudden, Antarctic sea ice was not expanding. And the question was no longer trying to understand why it was growing, but rather why it had crashed so dramatically and whether it would recover. And in the very early 2020s, it seemed to have recovered somewhat. And everyone was sort of holding their breath a little bit, thinking, maybe we're okay. And then, as you can clearly see at the end of the graph, we were not. But even though the end of that graph is alarmingly red, this actually hides one of the most alarming and concerning features of Antarctic sea ice change. To see that, we need to plot it slightly differently. We're going to plot each year on top of the other years. And so here, we've taken each year of anomalies from January to December and plotted them one on top of the other. So this is 1979 through to 2022, which encompasses that high period. You can see some red lines up the top, is the 2010s to 2015. And down the bottom, there are some orange and red lines. And I want to take this as a background. So we're going to put these into grey. And we're going to think, okay, this is everything we knew about Antarctic sea ice at the beginning of 2023. We can see that there's usually quite a lot of variability in December and January in that peak melt season. And then there's another large amount of variability from sort of March through to June, a time where we're growing the sea ice. But in February and September, October, there's not usually very much variability. So when we hit the minimum, it's usually pretty consistent. And when we hit the maximum in September, it's also pretty consistent. In 2023, this is what we saw. Not only was it lower than we had ever seen before, but we had an enormous loss of sea ice at a time of year where we had never seen much variability before. So this, frankly, was quite alarming. And if you try to do some statistics based on the variance that we had seen before and some fairly reasonable statistical assumptions, you ended up getting answers in June that told us this was a once in many millions of years event. 7.5 million was the figure for a while. By the time we got through to July and August, we ended up 7 standard deviations below the mean. And if you run the numbers on that, it's 1 in many hundreds of billions, which is a lot older than the age of the universe, and frankly just tells us that you can't do those sorts of stats on this data set. It tells us that something either had fundamentally changed or that we simply didn't understand Antarctic sea ice well enough to talk about how unusual something was. By the time we got to the end of 2023, it seemed to have recovered a little bit. It was no longer quite so unusual. And there was a sense of holding our breath once more. What was going to happen? And in the years since then, this is what we've seen. 2024 was again extraordinarily low during the winter. 2025 has been low, not quite as extraordinarily low, but still well below anything we saw apart from those last 2 years. And so this is adding evidence to the idea that something has fundamentally shifted in the Southern Ocean climate system, that Antarctic sea ice has entered a new regime and that perhaps it won't recover. Now, is this climate change? Or is it merely internal variability, the climate system wobbling around from one state to another? That's the question that the community is trying to answer. And there are lots of different ways that we're trying to answer that question, while simultaneously grappling with what are the impacts of the changes that we have seen. Because we don't need to be able to attribute those changes to a cause in order to understand the impacts. And so, what I'm going to be talking about today is trying to understand the causes of what we've seen, the impacts of those changes, and what it means for the future. Now, one of the ways that we try and understand what's happening is by taking large research vessels to inaccessible places and measuring them. So this is not the actual ship track from the Denman Marine voyage, but it's an indicative line showing you where they started and where they finished. The Denman Glacier system is in what we call East Antarctica. Now, you might think it's a bit odd to talk about east for a place that's at the South Pole because the coast is always to the north. Instead, we divide it up by longitude, and so the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. Hence, this is East Antarctica. It's the part where Australia has quite a large historical claim, though that is put aside currently under the Antarctic Treaty System. And it's where our Antarctic bases are. So the Denman Marine voyage on Noina went down to Antarctica. They were away from Hobart for 75 days. And when they got down there, this is what they found. They were able to approach right to the edge of the Denman Glacier, which was not at all what was expected. Now, Noina is a modern, powerful icebreaker, but even it struggles with thick sea ice. And so a voyage like this has a main plan and a backup plan and another backup plan with layers of contingencies built in. In the end, they needn't have worried. When they got down to Antarctica in March this year, there was no sea ice. This was not at all expected, scientifically it was a bit of a boon. They could go to places no one had ever been before. They could take samples of the sea. They could measure the sea floor and collect all sorts of amazing data sets and get stunning video footage and photographs like this of the Nuina close up to the ice shelves and the cliffs. But it is still quite alarming. And this picture, produced by Mark Horstman, the Antarctic Program Partnership's Media and Communications Officer, shows you just how strange it was. There should have been a lot of sea ice, more than 100 kilometres thick, more than 100 kilometres wide, between the coastline and the ocean. And instead they found none. Now this stands in pretty stark contrast to another historical voyage just over 100 years ago, where the research vessel Belgica set out from Belgium, and inadvertently they became the first people to winter south of the Antarctic Circle. So in 1897, at the very beginning of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, they set off to discover the unknown. They went south and they were sailing along the Antarctic Peninsula, and in March of 1898 they were stuck in the sea ice, trapped. If they had been there in 2023, this is what the sea ice would have looked like. Rather than being stuck, they probably wouldn't have seen any. And if they had been there in 2024, they also wouldn't have seen any. Or in March of 2025. But unluckily for them, they weren't. They were there in 1898. And this is what their ship looked like for the winter that they were trapped there. On board the RV Belgica was someone called Roald Amundsen, that you may have heard of. He's rather a famous figure in Antarctic exploration, and this was his first trip south, cutting his teeth. So they were trapped in the ice for 13 months, and eventually they were able to free themselves by using explosives on board to blast a channel through the sea ice and drag their ship back out to the open ocean and sail back to Europe. To a hero's welcome, they had a treasure trove of data that supported numerous scientific publications. But again, if they had been there in 2023, they wouldn't have been stuck in the ice until June, many, many months later. Now, obviously, 2 data points are not enough to draw significant conclusions, but they are quite alarming, I think. The comparison between these 2 voyages is stark and shows us that the pace of change has been alarming. Now, one of the reasons that we care about Antarctica is sea level rise. The Antarctic ice sheet is a giant ice block, about 4 kilometres thick, the size of a continent, and it contains enough fresh water that if it were to entirely melt, it would raise global sea levels by about 60 metres. There are a lot of places within 60 metres of the current sea level. Now, this is something that we've been worried about for quite a long time, and although I was technically alive when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wrote their first report, I don't actually remember it. It's kind of strange for me to consider a world before the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, before the climate science community came together every 5 or so years for a heroic effort to write an assessment report that authoritatively synthesizes all of climate science knowledge together into one easy-to-read document. So in 1990, the first attempt at this was published. And they said this: "Within the next century, it is not likely that there will be a major outflow of ice from West Antarctica due directly to global warming." That's quite a relief, isn't it? That's pretty good. So even then, they knew global warming was a thing, but they were fairly confident that we should be okay. You know, the Antarctic ice sheet is enormous. Maybe we're going to change some other things, but we shouldn't expect to be changing that within the coming century. If we fast forward 30 years, This is a paper led by Caitlin Norton that came out in 2023, and their conclusion is rather sobering. The opportunity to preserve the West Antarctic ice sheet in its present-day state has probably passed, and policymakers should be prepared for several metres of sea level rise in the coming centuries. In 33 years, we went from thinking we couldn't affect the Antarctic ice sheet to thinking we have already lost control of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and we have locked in multiple metres of sea level rise. It's quite confronting. So again, it shows not only is the climate changing rapidly, but our understanding of it is developing at an incredible pace. Now, why do we care about sea level rise? Essentially because many of us live by the coast. And I really like this schematic from the Climate Council. It shows on the left the current situation where the high tide comes up, and in the middle you put a storm surge on top of that. So when you have something like a cyclone or a big low pressure system come over, the winds push the water towards the coast, the low atmospheric pressure sucks it up a little bit. All of these effects come together to raise the sea level just for a little while. And at the moment, most of the houses in the infrastructure are high enough above that sea level that they're not inundated and flooded. But on the right, after some sea level rise has happened, that high tide and storm surge come together and the infrastructure is flooded. It is inundated. In 2008, there was a report by the Department of Climate Change, Energy and Environment, which said that Australia had $226 billion worth of infrastructure within 1 metre of sea level. If you cast your mind back just one slide, you might remember that we have apparently locked in multiple metres of sea level rise for the coming centuries. That's many, many billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that we will need to fortify or to move or to rebuild when it gets destroyed. And that's pretty confronting. Now, if we look at climate change predictions for global sea level rise, this is a graph from the IPCC's 6th assessment report, the most recent one to be published, and it gives us some different scenarios. Now, for those of you who don't work in climate science day in, day out, SSP means Shared Socioeconomic Pathway, and it's our best guess for how society will evolve into the future. And because we don't have crystal balls, we have different options for that. So down the bottom, we have SSP 119, which is a very low emissions future. And then SSP 585 is a high emissions future. Now, the good news is we used to think something like 585 was the pathway that we were on. But we are making progress, and that now looks to be too high for our best predictions of the future. So, congratulations to us as a society. The future is looking less bad than it did not all that long ago. Now, there's also a dotted line on this graph labelled as a low likelihood, high impact storyline. That relies on some processes that have been hypothesized to exist but never directly observed. And if you talk to some sea level specialists, they don't like that line, and they think that it is somewhere between scaremongering and unhelpful. And I think they're probably right, because if that line is the only reason you care about sea level rise, you're not paying attention. Because these lines don't stop going up in 2100. And if we follow them through to 2300, even a very low emissions scenario, SSP 126, which is well below our best estimate of the emissions pathway we are currently on, has between 1 and 3 metres of sea level rise by 2300. And the higher emissions scenario has between 2 and 7 metres. Now, obviously the time it takes to arrive is important here, but 2300 is, in terms of a society, not that far away. And 7 metres of sea level rise is frankly civilization redefining. It's not a bit of a challenge or something to deal with next week, but it is an enormous problem. So I'd like to zoom in for now. We've been talking about very large global scale predictions of what might happen into the future. And what I'd like to do now is go through some recent research on some of the more small scale impacts around Antarctica. The red line on this map represents a current called the Antarctic Slope Current, and it runs around the Antarctic slope, so the edge of the continental shelf around Antarctica. And it forms something of a barrier between the open ocean to the north and the Antarctic coastal regions and ice sheet to the south. And that barrier is rather important if you care about getting heat in the open ocean down towards the ice shelves and melting them. And so understanding how that current is likely to change into the future is rather an important question. And it's a question that Ellie Ong, who was a graduate student at UNSW, who's just recently finished her PhD, looked into. And she used some experiments. Here we have a control, so that is more or less the current climate running forward. One where she added, or the wind and thermal components of climate change were added. So the world got warmer and the winds changed. And then there's another experiment where meltwater from the Antarctic ice sheet has been added into this simulation. And you can see that the wind and thermal has very little impact on either the coastal current or the slope current, but that adding that meltwater dramatically accelerates the Antarctic slope current. And not just a linear acceleration, but a non-linear acceleration into the future. Now, because this current forms a barrier between the warm waters to the north and the cold ice shelves to the south, any change to its dynamics has the potential to dramatically impact how heat is moved southwards and melts these ice shelves. And so understanding both that this change is likely to happen and what that means are very important. And the reason that the current accelerates is because ocean water, its density is controlled by its temperature and its saltiness. And as the meltwater collected on the Antarctic slope, it changes the salinity. So this is a slightly complicated graph. Antarctica is on the left, the open ocean is to the right, and the normalized distance is simply a way of trying to average the continental shelf all the way around Antarctica. And you can see that up near the surface of the ocean, the colours are blue. That means that it is less salty, it is fresher. And down below, they're a bit pinker, and that means it's saltier. And as we move forward in time, you can see that the left-hand part of this graph, the continental shelf, gets a bit bluer. And if we move forward into the 2040s, it becomes much, much bluer. So this is the meltwater from the Antarctic ice sheet collecting on the Antarctic slope and the Antarctic shelf. Now, potentially this is good news. It suggests that the current is able to corral that water under the ice shelves. But one of the things about the ocean around there is that variability and small-scale features can move quite large quantities of heat and salt very rapidly. And so it may be that we do have a lot of fresh, cold water accumulating on that shelf, but also that we are moving much more heat up onto it. And future investigations will look at this. One of the other impacts of corralling all that fresh water on the shelf is that it has the potential to change the formation of dense shelf water, that water that cascades down the continental slope, becoming Antarctic bottom water and filling up almost half of the global ocean. Now, the black line on this represents an average of the predictions from the CMIP6 ensemble. So that is the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project Phase 6. That's where all of the world's climate modelling community comes together and runs projections for the future of our climate. And so this suggests that the Antarctic overturning circulation, the formation of that dense shelf water, will slow down by about 20% by 2100. But we know that these models are missing many key processes around Antarctica. And one of the processes that they're missing is a realistic representation of the melt of the Antarctic ice sheet. So a higher resolution model that includes that melting and the fresh water going into the ocean around Antarctica paints quite a different picture. Rather than a gentle decline over the coming century, it suggests a 40% drop in the coming decades, which is quite alarming. But if we look at the observations, so when people have taken ships south and measured things, they suggest that perhaps it has already slowed down by about 20%. So this overturning circulation forms part of that global ocean conveyor belt that moves heat and salt and nutrients around. It also supports the ocean to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which helps slow the rate of climate change. So having it change by 20% already in the past few decades and having predictions of it slowing down by 40% or more in the coming decades is quite alarming. It suggests that changes are happening already, that they are significant, and that they have the opportunity to feed back onto the climate system in fairly concerning ways. Now, if we zoom in again to look at Antarctic sea ice, it serves many important physical, biological, and even societal roles around Antarctica. And this little schematic shows what a normal summer looks like, or at least a historically normal summer. You have the penguins using the sea ice as a platform to live and to breed and to molt, seals doing the same. You have that green splodge below the ice, which represents the phytoplankton who use the ice as a habitat. The little red bits are krill that feed on that phytoplankton and find refuge and safe haven on the underside of the ice. The sunbeams are coming down and they hit that ice, and rather than being absorbed by the Earth, they're reflected back out into space. And if we look instead at a recent summer, it looks more like this. So there's much less ice. Those sunbeams, rather than being reflected out, more of them are absorbed by the ocean, which has warmed up significantly. The loss of ice around Antarctica has freed up opportunities for cruise ships and tourist vessels to come and explore otherwise unvisited places. We've changed from phytoplankton that live under and with the sea ice to those that live in the open ocean. And we think that that's going to negatively impact the krill, which are the foundation of the rest of the Antarctic food web. So I'd like to step through some of these processes in a little bit more detail. And if you'll bear with me, this is probably the most technical slide of the talk. What we're looking at here is an averaged temperature around the Antarctic coastline. So it's a very large area that we have averaged together. And then we have done a statistical model to look at the predicted change in temperature from the loss of sea ice, like we saw in the 2016 summer, which at the time was the lowest summer we had ever seen. It was a record low. And this suggests that if the response were the same as any other temperature response, just scaled up a little bit, it should warm in that summer, and that warmth should come back again a little bit in the following summer, after which it's gone. So then we ran a computer simulation using one of our climate models to check that prediction and to see what our model suggests the temperature response would actually be. The first thing you'll notice is that the top left-hand corner of that bottom graph is redder and it's a bigger splodge of colour. So the warming is more intense, it lasts for longer and it goes deeper. But the most alarming feature of this graph is that that red colour comes back the following summer and the one after, and just a little bit for the one after that. This suggests that the temperature response was not just a larger version of the average warming that happens, but was in fact qualitatively different and lasts for multiple years. That means that we have the opportunity or the possibility for warming to compound. If we have a low sea ice summer, we have locked in some warmth that sticks around for 3 years. And if we have another low summer within those 3 years, that warming can add. Now, the 4 lowest summers that we have measured since the late 1970s, when the satellites started measuring Antarctic sea ice, are the 4 most recent summers. So we may well be in a situation where this warmth is compounding from year to year, and extra heat is absorbed in one summer and sticks around, and then the next summer even more gets added again. That's not a particularly comfortable place to be, but it looks as though that's what's happening. One of the other reasons that we care about the loss of sea ice in the summer is that sea ice is able to protect the Antarctic coast from damaging waves and swells in the Southern Ocean. Now, the Southern Ocean is an extraordinarily windy place, and that wind creates very large waves. And those waves, when they hit the sea ice, they lose their energy. They are damped away. And you can see it very clearly in the satellite data. You might have 5-metre high waves in the open ocean, but within 100 kilometres or so of the sea ice, they've all but disappeared. So losing summer sea ice around the edge of Antarctica means that those waves are able to hit the edge of the continent or the ice shelves. And when they hit an ice shelf, they fatigue it, they wear it out, they bend it, and eventually it breaks, and it breaks away into icebergs. So you can see here on the graph, all of the purple regions are ice shelves that were more exposed to open ocean conditions in low sea ice summers. There are a few browny orange colours near the Antarctic Peninsula, and those represent regions where the local sea ice doesn't really gel with the global average. And so local dynamics are dominating in there. But all around the rest of Antarctica, we see that when the average amount of sea ice around Antarctica is low, these ice shelves are far more exposed to the open ocean. If we take that data and we plot it up, on the left, you can see summer sea ice plotted against average exposure in summer, and this just makes the point that I was describing before. When there is less sea ice, you have more exposure. So the line goes from the top left down to the bottom right. And as I suggested, the reason that we care about that is that it fatigues the ice shelves and breaks them up into icebergs that drift away. And so on the right-hand side, you can see that summers with low sea ice form many more icebergs than summers with lots of sea ice, about twice as many. So just over 200 icebergs in a low sea ice summer versus about 100 in a normal or high sea ice summer. Now, ice shelves lose ice in one of 2 ways. It either melts into the ocean directly, or it breaks off as an iceberg and drifts away and melts a little bit further north. If we increase the rate of iceberg formation, we weaken these ice shelves and we erode them more quickly. And we care about that because these ice shelves help to hold back the ice that is still sitting on the land. And as that ice on the land flows off into the ocean, it contributes to sea level rise. So the longer we can keep it on the land, the longer the sea level stays at the same spot. So breaking off icebergs is likely to accelerate sea level rise. And concerningly, it's a process that isn't included in our climate models for the future projections of sea level rise, this sea ice iceberg feedback that we've identified. So that's rather a lot about the impacts of these sea ice changes. And I did promise that I would talk about some of the causes that we've identified. This is work that's currently underway, led by Hannah Dawson, sitting up the back. And she has taken one of these global coupled climate models and imposed some warming in the deep ocean to mimic the warming that we have seen, and then run these models forward in time. And you can see that at the beginning of her perturbation, the sea ice anomalies, some are positive, some are negative, but on average they're about 0. And as these models run forward, you can see many, many more years, and they're starting to show a bit of a negative impact. And just a few of the simulations are now showing losses of sea ice in that early winter period, May through to July, that time of year when we were so shocked to see Antarctic sea ice disappearing in the observations. So if you sort of wave your hands a little bit and look at the graph on the right, which is from the observations, and the plots on the left, which are from the models, it looks rather alarming and suggests that this deep ocean warming may well be driving part of this wintertime loss of sea ice. Now, as we run forward through the next few years, you can see that the multi-ensemble mean, so this is the average of all the climate perturbations that Hannah has been running, shows a really distinctive seasonality to the sea ice loss in her simulations. It shows the loss of sea ice in the wintertime. So this is the strongest evidence we have so far to show that the changes in the ocean are driving these changes in the sea ice. And we know that anthropogenic climate change, so human influence, is what is causing that ocean warming. Scientists have a very particular way of describing this. We call it detection and attribution. And as a general rule, climate scientists tend to be a rather conservative lot before they will say this is absolutely human-induced. We have met that threshold for the ocean warming. We will categorically say that it is being driven by human emissions. And so taking that ocean warming and showing that it directly results in sea ice changes like this is very strong evidence that the change in seasonality that we have seen in Antarctic sea ice is caused by humans. So to summarise, this is what historically sea ice looked like in the summers, with the biology interacting with the sea ice and a climate system where much of the sunlight was reflected back into space. In more recent years, we've lost that protective blanket of sea ice, and that loss of sea ice is making global warming about 10 to 15% faster than it would otherwise have been. It's also changing global ocean currents as well as regional ocean currents, and it's having catastrophic impacts on some of the wildlife near Antarctica. There are about 60 or so breeding sites for emperor penguins. They rely on the sea ice to form their colonies and to breed. About 30 of those have experienced what we call a catastrophic breeding failure, where the ice melted before the chicks were ready to go to sea and all of the chicks died. And about 16 of them have experienced that more than once. There is at least one known colony that has abandoned its historical breeding location and moved elsewhere. You might be thinking that's a lot of doom and gloom and that we're essentially toast. But that's the wrong conclusion to take from this. Yes, the changes are stark. Yes, there's a lot of bad news. But the future is in our hands. The thing about climate change being caused by humans is that it's caused by humans, which means that we can affect what happens in the future. It's not that long ago that we were on a pathway consistent with the very high emissions projections. And through concerted international effort, we have moved from that very high pathway down to merely the high pathway. You can see that current policies point to the intermediate projections. We're not implementing all of those policies as well as we would like, and so we're not there yet. But we get to choose. And so we have moved from very high to high, and it's within our power to move from high to intermediate or perhaps even to low. Now, the pace of change is staggering, and I like to think that I'm not that old, but I'm already old enough to remember ecosystems that have all but vanished. Here in Tasmania, we've lost 95% of our giant kelp forests, which is a staggering figure. And I can remember seeing those kelp forests on the surface of the ocean. The boat ramp at Fortescue Bay used to be kind of annoying to use because the kelp would get in the way. It doesn't anymore. It's no longer there. But we can avoid making the future worse. We know this, absolutely. Every molecule of carbon dioxide that we don't emit into the atmosphere makes the future a better place. And so our actions now will set the course of what happens in coming years. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about how you can impact the future of climate, UTAS has just recently put together an online course that discusses not only climate science and the impacts of what's happening, but some of the ways that individuals can make an impact, from individual actions through to collective action, through to political action. I was involved in the course and thus am obviously biased, but I think it is an amazing resource and one that I strongly recommend you go and check out if you're interested. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes. Yes.
Up the back.
Maria. Yeah. First of all, I don't know if you're all aware, but there's an independent review of the Climate Change State Action Act 2008 in Tasmania. It's due today, any submissions, and basically there's something about it in the paper today that we need a climate change commissioner. The other thing is, what are the impacts of war and volcanoes, which are increasing? What will the impact be on the stadium, and the impacts of tourism on the Antarctic?
Okay, rather a lot of questions there. Even though I'm a climate scientist, I think climate change is the wrong lens to view war through. Undoubtedly it causes many emissions, but I don't think anyone could argue that's the biggest impact of any war. If you're trying to motivate for peace simply through the climate cost of the war, I think you're missing the bigger picture. And I will leave that there. The impact of climate change on the stadium? Well, it's certainly less than 60 metres above the current sea level. So if we have truly lost control of the Antarctic ice sheet, it's in trouble. It's less than 5 metres above the current sea level, so even the West Antarctic ice sheet is probably a problem for the stadium. But again, I think you're probably not thinking about the stadium in the right way if you're worried about its future inundation. And while I have my personal opinions on the usefulness of another stadium in Hobart, which I'm not convinced that we need, it's not my place to dictate what people should do or say about the stadium. Could you remind me what the final part of your question was?
The tourism. And in terms of war, I just thought, the increase in bombing and whatever that enters the atmosphere, therefore changes what's happening, and there's a heap of, drones and bombs and things like that. That's concerning, and it would increase everything. But the tourism, there was an article in the ABC about that.
Absolutely. Yes, so Antarctic tourism is becoming vastly more popular. The numbers have increased dramatically. Now, there is quite a significant carbon cost for getting to Antarctica. Is that worth it? Perhaps. If everybody who goes to Antarctica comes back and becomes an advocate for climate and for the Antarctic, perhaps it is worth the carbon cost of them going there and seeing this incredible place. Could they instead have been advocates for climate policies without going there? I rather hope so. And certainly that would be a lower impact way of achieving that aim. Antarctic tourism is, however, not a major cause of our emissions on average. Is it unnecessary? Undoubtedly. Nobody needs to go to Antarctica for tourism. Many of us want to go, no doubt. It's a stunning place. It looks incredible. But there are things that we can do, and we have the technology to do, that can reduce our emissions dramatically right now. And while it's somewhat of a cop-out, taking that low-hanging fruit and working on the things that we can change, electrifying houses and transport, decarbonising the electrical grid, these are all easy. And not only are they wins for climate, in general, they're wins for everything else. We can reduce air pollution by closing down coal-fired power stations. We can make houses more comfortable by insulating them and heating them with reverse cycle air conditioners or heat pumps. And that's better not only for us as a society, but for the people involved individually. So yes, Antarctic tourism, maybe it is part of that low-hanging fruit, but there are places where I would start rather than starting there. I remember you also said volcanoes. Yes, so we see a huge impact on the global climate from volcanoes. They cause a short-term cooling by pumping lots of sulfate aerosols, so tiny little particles that contain sulfur, into the upper atmosphere, and they reflect some of the sunlight back into space. That's actually been proposed as a possible geoengineering solution because it's relatively cheap to get stuff up into the upper atmosphere and could reflect some of the sun's energy. There are enormous ethical and engineering challenges to overcome for doing that, and I would much rather see us simply reduce our carbon emissions before we try these processes to reduce the impacts or some of the impacts of those emissions. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Ed, you've talked about a couple of positive feedback mechanisms.
We did start waiting for the mic because it picks up on the for the recording.
Ed, you've talked about a couple of positive feedback mechanisms. I just wondered, do we know much about the future risk of tipping points and runaway change?
This is absolutely one of the things that keeps the climate science community up at night, worrying about tipping points. I don't think we need to worry about tipping points to motivate climate action, or at least we shouldn't. They are undoubtedly scary, and the prospect of reaching a point where something dramatically changes and can't easily be reversed is frankly terrifying. We may well have already passed some of the tipping points. The West Antarctic ice sheet stability is a good example of that. That paper led by Caitlin Norton suggesting we've lost control of it is a suggestion that we have already passed the tipping point for that ice sheet. I do, however, think it's worth considering tipping points as essentially the distracted boyfriend meme. You know, there's the girl walking along with her boyfriend who's checking out someone else and she looks at him in disgust and horror. Climate change is the girlfriend there, right? We should already be dealing with that, and tipping points are the person that the boyfriend is checking out on the way past. Are they concerning? Yes, absolutely. Are they eye-catching? Without a doubt. But we should be motivated to fix this even without worrying about them. Now, we are probably going to blast through a bunch of our global tipping points. And that's pretty concerning. The best thing we can do on that is reduce the magnitude of the warming that we cause. So by doing our best to deal with climate change, we're also dealing with tipping points. As a science community, we are trying very hard to work out exactly when those tipping points are going to come, but predicting something that we haven't seen before is challenging, and thus great uncertainty remains.